My name's Barry Cranford. I run the London CTOs along with lots of help from Don Carlo, who you probably see on the list, and also run RecWorks, which is a tech recruitment company. So at RecWorks, what we're all about is trying to find ways that recruitment can be a force for good in the tech industry, beyond just getting people jobs. And as Jim Goff put it recently on Twitter, we're trying to redefine the value that recruiters can bring to the tech community. So what that means is that we're not just about getting people jobs, but we want to help people really try and find a passion for what it is that they do, and then help them go all in on it through communities, events, and mentoring and that kind of thing. So a few highlights: we've organised communities and user groups now of over 10,000 people. We've run over 800 events, and we've made over 3,000 personal mentoring introductions. And it's all sort of part of a free service, all stuff that we do for free. And how that works is that we basically place developers typically, but people all the way up the chain, and then take a chunk of that revenue and drive it back into community initiatives. So this is the London CTOs Roundtable, and it is intended to be a roundtable. So I've got some questions prepared to stir the pot here and there, but really it's more up to you guys. If you've got things you want to add, things you want to contribute, questions you want to ask, anything like that, then either put them on the chat or feel free to just unmute your microphone and ask away. And so I need to have a volunteer here. So we basically, this is all about due diligence and tech due diligence. So from having seen the answers to the signups, I know some people here have never done this before and are completely green. Other people are running businesses doing this already. Some are getting nervous because it's approaching and they don't know too much about it. So what I'm interested in to kick it off is somebody who's either doing this as a business or who's run a couple of these projects already, and is happy to give an overview for the perspective of any newcomers here that have never been through this. What is a typical due diligence project? What does it look like? How long does it last? What do you end up with? And things like that. So is anyone happy to jump in? Rich, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. Okay. So in the absence of anyone else, so I've been running a tech consulting and DD practice independently for about 4 months. So a mid-pandemic new business enterprise, which is possibly foolhardy, but it's been going okay so far. And I've also been working with a couple of different VC and PE houses for the past 2 or 3 years, Gresham House, Octopus Ventures, as well as lots of experience on the other side of the table as a consulting CTO or founder, going through fundraising processes for seed and Series A. I think one of the things that I find is quite surprising about the position that DD takes for startups is how little information there is available about what the due diligence process actually is. Certainly having been through 3 or 4 rounds of fundraising for various different companies before, there's a widespread perception, even actually a widespread perception coming from investment houses and from advisors walking people through the process, that due diligence is a kind of a slightly vague kicking of the tires of your tech. You know, it's almost an afterthought, you know, sort of, oh yes, and by the way, as we work towards heads of terms, you know, there'll be some technical due diligence as well. You know, we'll help you with that when the time comes. And then when the time comes, actually the people who are responsible for furnishing the due diligence team with the information they need haven't really been prepped. So one of the things that I try to do as part of consultancy for startups is walk them through the process of changing their mindset around preparation and planning and strategy, so that they've always got a sort of continuous due diligence mindset. Because a lot of what due diligence, certainly tech due diligence providers are going to be looking for during that process isn't rocket science. It's, it's an emphasis on well-planned roadmap and understanding who your customer is, and making sure that the technology team and engineering people and management and your commercial and your financial teams are all aligned, and that you all understand who your audience is and where the data is going to go, and making sure that you've got the technical capability to do it, and that your projections reflect the resourcing that you're going to need to do that. And there's a lot, there's a lot more deep dive detail to that, but basically that's the headline. Are you geared up to do what you need to do? Do you understand what's coming down the line? And when you get your money, do you actually have a realistic view of how you're going to use it to deliver on the roadmap? And is communication adequate between your engineering team and everybody else in the company to make sure you're all aligned? And everything else comes off the back of that: architecture and data strategy and GDPR compliance and audit and, CI/CD pipeline design and all that kind of stuff. That all flows off the back of that. But so few teams have got much of an idea of that as the big picture. I'd be interested to hear from other people at the roundtable about their experiences being on the other side of it, and whether they actually have gone into this feeling like their hands have been held properly by their advisors.
Kaustav, yeah. Are you on mute there, Kaustav?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Thanks for that, Rich. That was really interesting. It's more of a question from me for you, Rich, and for everyone else. I'm interested in the flip side, on the mergers and acquisitions side, and the due deal process that would need to be done from that perspective. And I would imagine there'll be elements of the three things that you mentioned around well-planned roadmap and understanding who your audience is, etc. But from an M&A perspective, what advice do people have in terms of tech due diligence? If, for example, I was in a position to research and then eventually make an offer to merge with or acquire a business into my existing business.
So personally, I haven't worked a great deal on M&A projects. In fact, my experience with M&A projects is limited to one, which is a company I'm a shareholder in right now, which we're in the process of doing an exit to a tech PE house. But my experience of working with them is probably a little bit atypical, because they are, to all intents and purposes, they're a strategic holding company. They buy businesses and then they grow them, and they network between those businesses in a hopefully mutually useful way, but they don't tend to integrate those businesses into their wider business. I would say the closest that I've come, and other people might be able to speak more accurately on this, is the sort of partnership evaluation basis. So when you're coming on board as a SaaS or a business services provider to a large enterprise or public sector organization, from my understanding of people who have been through it, the M&A DD process is quite similar to that. So that's looking at what the process of onboarding your team is going to be, and doing a gap analysis. So where seed and Series A due diligence tends to be around making sure that the picture that's being presented to the outside world is an accurate one, plus a gap analysis as well. But that gap analysis is more in the context of making sure that the roadmap is realistic, and that all the things that you have planned for the future cover off gaps in your credibility or capability or client base or whatever. But as far as M&A goes, it's much more about the operational health of the business. So do you have adequate resourcing in place to fulfill the needs of your customers as it stands right now? It's less about where you're going. It's more about, why you're doing the M&A, the mindset of the team. So, your engineering team are probably currently a relatively standalone unit who are used to operating as a service provider via project delivery, product delivery colleagues and a commercial team. But what's it going to be like to integrate your engineering team into a wider engineering team? Is it going to be absorptive? Is it going to be a separate business unit where you have occasional roundtables where you share ideas? So it depends on what that M&A looks like and what the target is like. But certainly my observations about it is that it's just as much about culture and gaps in operational processes as it is about tech. There are many, many ways to skin a cat when it comes to deploying out systems architecture. But yeah, I mean, it's about how you go about doing that and making sure everybody's focused on the right goal. I'm going to hand across to Steve, who raised his hand.
Oh, cheers. So I've got a little experience on the acquisition side of this. I've done about, my last main role, I did about 10 deals of an average of $50 million value each. I guess there's two different ways to look at this. One is as sort of a technologist, and then the other as a sort of from the business point of view. So as a technologist, we tend to focus on these issues of, well, do we look okay? Is there anything we're hiding that we sort of want to keep hidden, or is it okay if we show that? All these sort of things, and all the things Rich just mentioned about how you get folded into another company, or are you being an independent kind of company, or is there the idea that it'll do that? There's another aspect of this altogether. My experience has been that the technology due diligence has had very little effect on the overall business case to acquire or not. There have been a couple of cases where we found out, mainly through understanding the market that the company was in and the way their technology interacted with that, found out whether they really had something unique, or whether it was something that didn't have a big kind of moat around it, right? It wasn't really a big defensible piece of IP. The other aspect that I think is important is understanding the reason why the acquiring company is interested. And they're not always forthcoming about this. And so it's like the reason why they're acquiring the company may or may not have anything to do with your current roadmap and where you think you're going as the company being acquired. It may be for totally different reasons, which might make it kind of irrelevant what your current roadmap is. And understanding that will also help a lot with understanding the value of your company to the acquiring company. So there's kind of a lot there. It's very easy to get caught up in kind of thinking about where you think you are and what purpose you think you've got. But that just might not be the case of the company that's looking to acquire you. And they may or not be forthcoming about that. I think they'd often be forthcoming about that with the founders, but whether that gets out to more peripheral people, depending on whether the technology people are sort of more peripheral or more, directly founders or not, it depends. So I guess the warning I'd give is it's very easy to make a lot of assumptions about why the company is potentially being acquired, what the interest is, and what happens after it, and sort of, make these assumptions go off in that direction and get quite sort of misaligned with expectations about what's happening during the M&A.
Thank you.
That answers your question there, Kaustav. You feel that's
yeah. I mean, I was asking it from the perspective of being the acquirer. Potentially, I'm currently going through a deal process at the moment, which started off with desk research on potential target acquisition opportunities. And I've been looking at the fundamentals, the usual stuff that you would normally turn to Companies House, looking at the profiles of the founders, how long they've been in business for, et cetera, that kind of list of things. But then, from there, engaging with those companies and then trying to build a rapport and trying to identify if there is an opportunity to move the conversation from that high level, let's get to know each other, to, okay, let's have more of a serious conversation. That's the bit that I haven't quite got to yet, but I'm sort of heading towards. But yeah, that was really helpful, Steve and Rich, listening to both your perspectives on that.
There's one more thing I'd mention just based on what you just said. So there are different kinds of companies. There are different ways of assessing their value and their potential future value. And so if you're sort of Series A, B startup, it looks one way. For your FT 100 company, it looks quite different. The expectation of how valuable that company is based on its revenue, its EBITDA, all that kind of thing, looks quite different. And so there's this kind of thing that can happen when a startup that's been going for a couple of years is acquired by a very established large global company, which changes its valuation just in the moment of the acquisition, regardless of anything else. It's kind of, kind of a weird way that the finances sort of get looked at. I mean, we could go into this for a long time, but that's probably not, a good use of our time here. But I sort of wanted to point that out. It's like it's really important to consider the kind of company, financially speaking, that is being acquired, and the kind of company that's doing the acquisition, and what the gap is between those, because things just may not be as they seem, or they might be.
Yeah.
Frank, just quickly seeing your mic's gone on mute, and then Rich, I'll come on to you after that.
Cheers. I haven't done any formal due diligence, but the way Rich described it and others, it's very an assessment of the state, look at the total cost of ownership, look at the strategy, maybe develop a new target operating model, look at the capabilities and gaps. Maybe the uniqueness is valuation, which you wouldn't necessarily do coming in as a CTO, CIO. But are there any frameworks or models you apply to that process? I mean, what makes formal due diligence formal as opposed to, well, this is the kind of thing anyone should be doing in a permanent CTO role? Be interested to hear thoughts, or I suppose there's a question around what tools and frameworks help you get that process done.
I mean, speaking for myself as a provider of DD services, there aren't any specific frameworks that I look for. I mean, it tends simply because every company is so radically different in terms of how they go about doing it. Every due diligence provider, and other people may have come across frameworks for this. I haven't. I would frankly, I would love to have one. It would be very nice to be able to deliver the technology team for target companies a standardized checklist and get them to send back a technology data room in the same way as my finance colleagues get a finance data room. But because it is so specific to the type of technology that's being delivered, I think it would be quite difficult to genericize it to the point where it was both standardized and also really in-depth and useful. You end up getting into the weeds fairly soon, depending on the type. Just to give you an example, I've done a due diligence project for one company recently, which is providing candidate assessment services for the recruitment industry. And they have a very small number of very large clients, and so the due diligence for them was much more around integration, data ingestion, and ETL capabilities, and whether or not they had the ability to move fast for some big enterprise clients. But then there was another client who was doing work around e-health assessments, where it was all about scaling up to help the healthcare systems of nations. Their product was very simple. The front end was extremely straightforward. It was essentially a single page application and then some data shunting technology behind the scenes. But that was much more around an examination of things like service desk capabilities and high availability, and how they were using AWS for redundancy. And so I'm not necessarily looking for a specific thing or a specific methodology in a way that you could tick a box. It's much more around making sure that they understand how their own processes work. If they're using CI/CD of some kind for deployment, do they actually fully understand it? Do the commercial team talking to clients understand the implications of the stuff that they're being given in tech sales presentations? That kind of thing. Anyone has any experience of working with tech due diligence frameworks, I'd be very interested to hear it, because it would certainly make the process a bit more streamlined. But it does tend to be pretty esoteric. Will?
Sadly, I don't have a framework, but so I've been involved in a few DDs on both sides. So I provide a DD at a kind of relatively low fundraise scale, and I guess defended a few times as well, and also been involved to a lesser extent in an M&A activity, and I don't think any of them have been the same at all. So just to echo what Rich is saying, and also just to build on what Steve says, I think it's very much about the instigator of the DD and understanding what they actually need to know, because it could be as simple as Rich says, kicking the tires. And And I've heard secondhand of acquisitions that have gone really badly because no one kicked the tires, which is super basic, but it could be really complicated. So if you're trying to acquire someone, for example, and intend to integrate technology platforms, that's a massive risk for both the acquirer and the acquiree. So yeah, I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all solution, unfortunately.
So oh, sorry, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
I just want to make 2 points on that one. So there's actually 2 sides. I mean, been involved with few due diligence on both sides. So there is one where it's a checklist from your auditor or the lawyers, where it's more like ticking the boxes. So that's a very standard one that is across pretty much every acquisitions we have gone through. And the other side of things is mostly from the technical people, where what they want to find out is that, firstly, whether your technology is scalable, whether there is enough security for it. Do they need any more injection of cash or personnel into your team if they acquire them? And the other part is, what is the team structure look like? So that's basically about what are the skill sets and things like that, which is very important in mergers and acquisitions. So although there is no framework, the process tends to be very similar. Only thing is that how much finer detail which you go for depends upon your industry. So if you have a tighter security thing like a banking, then your finer details will just go to almost every single point. But if it's something like say a normal e-commerce business, things like that, your due diligence is not that fine detail. So that's my experience from going through different of this. Just my 2 cents.
I would agree with everything Ren just said. I think there's so there are different reasons you got to align with your strategy people about the different reasons you might be acquiring, and I guess where you focus in whatever, however you look at your framework or whatever you're doing will depend on that. So are you acquiring a company because they have difficult to get customers? They've got big companies as customers that has a massively long sales cycle, and just having those customers gives you a step ahead in where you're getting to. Maybe you don't really care about their technology or team that much. Or are you acquiring them for their team because having a team with particular knowledge and capabilities and experience is super important, and you believe they're going to be able to grow that team? Or is it the technology itself, and it's just like remarkable technology? I've actually found that to be not really the case most often. It's normally kind of blah technology, but it's these other things that are important. Or is it the data they've got? Sometimes having a wealth of data that goes back, some years, and it's hard to get data, or it's no longer available even, but they've got that, and maybe that contributes to something that the acquiring company's doing, or there's some sort of big master plan of acquiring a couple of companies that don't know about each other very well and sort of combining them together in some way. And there's probably a couple of other possibilities within that. And so I think the thing that can go wrong is where you haven't aligned on that with whoever's doing the sort of strategic lead on this. And so you're looking at the wrong things, or you spend far too much time, looking at whether their CD is great or whether they've got unit tests or blah, 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 right? That could be critically important, or it could be just not important at all and no one cares.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, I think. And it's such a variable process depending on what the intended outcome is of that. I mean, actually, yeah, the example you just gave there, it's generally a lot more, and because one wants to do a good job of due diligence and provide ticks to the essential boxes, I would normally have conversations about version control, for example, of source code, or have a quick look over the data integrity of what they've got sitting there if the thing that's valuable is the data. And frankly, even if it's not, just tick the boxes and make sure that they do appear to be on top of everything they need to be. But it is so much about understanding the audience for that report at the other end and what it is that they're looking to get out of it. If you're bringing on board if you're bringing on board a company whose core technology is being purchased, if it's not an acqui-hire, if it is essentially about the IP of the product, then you're probably going to be much more concerned about, you know, the stability of the product, the IP protection, and what the process might look like for handing across to an internal engineering team or offshore team. And that due diligence process is going to be vastly different from one where the acquisition is about bringing on board a team who have deep level domain expertise. They might, as Steve says, have a deeply meh product, but their team may know everything there is to know about integration with a particular very esoteric type of lab equipment, in which case that's going to be much more examining employment contracts and, you know, team dynamic and communication between the engineering leads and the commercial team, and making sure that, you know, you haven't just bought into a company where the entire engineering team are going to walk off and found their own company next week. Because frankly, unless you've verified that the team is properly motivated and really embedded, there's very little that you can do to prevent an entire engineering team from walking off 6 weeks after you acquire them.
Okay, so I'm interested. Firstly, this is like fascinating as somebody that's never really delved beneath any kind of surface on this. It's all really, really interesting, especially the hard examples to kind of apply. But so you mentioned there, Rich, about getting into the weeds, like very quickly. You don't follow a framework necessarily. There isn't a framework, but quite quickly it kind of goes into the weeds with all these different companies, all these different things. So I'm interested to know what the process looks like, how long it might take, and how do you actually do it? You know, what does that actually look like when you say go into the weeds? You're sitting opposite someone talking about it. So how does that actually look?
So I want to make sure I provide in. I've done a lot of talking in this roundtable. I want to make sure I provide space for everybody else as well. But briefly, normally it'd start out with a brief from the potential investors or acquirers. I would make sure that the process doesn't start until I've got a good understanding of what their goals are. You know, are they looking for a growth company where they're just putting in some dumb money? Is it smart money where it's about coming on board with a company who need the VC team's expertise? What's the goal? Are they looking to sell in 3 years, 5 years, look for an industry exit, you know, organic growth, whatever it happens to be? And then I would gather together as much advanced documentation as possible to get up to speed on where the client is. And ideally, that's going to be their investment deck, their projections, and as much technical architecture documentation as they have. That in itself generally gives a pretty good indication of how, to the extent to which they've got their shit together. Basically, you know, if they say we have no technical documentation whatsoever, clearly that's going to affect the angle that I take with the interviews. You know, that's a big risk. How much is wrapped up in the head of a small number of people? Obviously that's going to get flagged up. And then it's walking the tree, really. So starting with the person who is engineering or technology lead, normally a CTO, but some companies just don't have CTOs. You know, they might have a de facto CTO in the form of a head of engineering or senior developer. And then walking the tree down, having them walk through with me verbally a product pitch, because the product pitch, as differs from the commercial product pitch, may in itself be enlightening when coming from a technical person. That frequently uncovers gaps between the actual capability and what's being sold. It is quite startling sometimes, actually, how much of a gap there is between the thing being sold to clients and the thing that's actually being delivered, which is not even necessarily a bad thing if they have the capability to do product A, but actually what people usually want is product, you know, A 0.5, and they're working towards a version 1, then I'm not going to put that up as a red flag. I'm going to figure out whether or not the clients actually need it to be the full version 1, or they're actually happy with the version 0.5, and what roadmap they have to get there, what the gap is between expectation, reality, and delivery timescales. And really just sort of exploring down that path. Have they got everything they need in order to fulfill the commitments they've already made? Does the financial projection and the money that they're, you know, that'll be injected support their ambitions? Do they already have the right resources to build everything they promised that they will be able to build? Or are they entirely reliant on getting this cash injection in? And if so, what does their resourcing strategy look like? Are they building on top of technologies which are hugely esoteric and hard to recruit for? That's a big thing that comes up pretty frequently. You know, their initial proof of concept may have been written using a particularly unusual platform or set of technologies because it happened to be the thing that employee number one was happy with and comfortable with. They've now got a serious recruitment problem, and that means they may have to re-platform in 6 months, at which point that would be a big red flag, because the investors should be aware that a big chunk of their investment may get eaten up in a straightforward re-platforming exercise rather than product growth. And that's how it goes. So walking the line all the way down, looking at the chain of dependencies, figuring out whether or not they've built a house of cards or something really solid where they've made sensible assumptions and they've got their eyes open. Once I've gone through that process, which normally involves anywhere between 2 or 3 up to interview a dozen or so members of staff, from that point forwards, that will go into a red flags meeting with the client. So I would, be a member of one or more of the investment board to talk through informally the findings, because in the background, other DD providers will be doing their jobs as well. So it's an opportunity for us to compare notes. For example, commercial and IP lawyers may have found that there is a particular piece of value in the company wrapped up in some piece of technology, but there's a discrepancy between the engineering team's understanding of their ownership and protection of that tech versus the commercial team, at which point, again, that becomes a red flag. And then finally, it all gets written up into a report. This varies wildly. I tend to err on the side of very thorough. Some DD providers like to offer up a, sort of 3-page, very succinct summary with some simple bullet points and then more in-depth conversations if needed. I generally tend to deliver something, sort of 20 pages with a relatively in-depth analysis of everything from commercial technology strategy to communications and IP protection and high availability, along with a big red, amber, green status list of risks at the back in a formal risk registry. And the aim is not to catch the company out. It's to make sure that everybody involved in the transaction knows what it is they're getting themselves in for. And sometimes those startups actually then engage me as a consultant after the investment to help them work through that list and cover some of those high risk items off. I would like to think that the end of the process for me is all the parties walking away very positive about it. That even if it's raised a bunch of stuff with them, they've got an action plan for making their company more stable moving forward. Anyway, sorry, that was a lot of talking from me.
That's super interesting. Really, really interesting.
Feel free to pick this up.
Oh, yeah, that's really, I found that really interesting. Thanks for that, Rich. I mean, especially from the perspective of, as an acquirer, I guess it's incumbent upon me to write that brief so that I can actually go out to market and present to the acquiree my goals. Here's the reasons why. And then I suppose it's the dangling the carrot to interest the potential acquirees to actually connect and continue the conversation, I guess.
Okay, thanks. Chris, Galley, yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Bit of background, I've done 3 successful due diligence pieces for sort of internally for an acquiring company that were looking to buy and add the businesses, and then another 3 on behalf of a PE house, or on behalf of PE houses through a technical due diligence specialist company. I've been listening to some of this in the car. I've just actually got into the office, so I've missed a few bits because the signal's been bad. So forgive me if I'm repeating stuff. Just to start at the high level, the technical due diligence in every case has been very much the last piece, and is almost we ought to do it, rather than it being an integral part of the financial, sales or legal due diligence, which tend to take much, much higher precedence. And therefore it tends to get tagged on at the end. I think Steve was mentioning it as well. Sort of effectively as the heads of terms are being drawn up, it's we ought to do this due diligence piece. it often misses out. And as a result of the people, one of the other things, Kaustav, is that you have this agency problem where, you know, even though you may put in clauses and stuff in the deal document in terms of warranties, there's this agency problem where, you know, they're not wanting necessarily to detail all the problems. Very often you do not get to speak to the right people. You will be speaking to a minority who are high level, simply because the fact the deal is happening, they don't want white, or either they don't want, or if it's anything publicly traded, they just cannot let people know what's happening because they can't announce it to the markets. So it's very, very carefully guarded, and therefore you are only dealing with the very top people, and therefore you have that agency problem that it's very difficult to get the detailed information that you need on the areas that are important. As I think Rich was talking about, that of the 6 I've done, 3 of them have been fairly lightweight because they've been internal in terms of the final reports and erring on the sort of, or tending towards the 5-6 pages. The others for this technical company, technical due diligence business, tended to be about 60 pages and go into an awful lot of detail. Not necessarily actually what I would regard as valuable detail, but it was more a case of sort of churning the wheel and going through all the pieces. Very, very formulaic, a huge amount of time spent in quality assurance of the document, of getting it right and trying to show that you're adding value. Whereas actually 2 or 3 pages would highlight, you know, Pareto principle, sort of 80% of the issues that you found and the areas that you're looking at. The other piece that, certainly if you're looking at businesses acquiring others, that tends to get dropped off is looking forward. Very often it's a CEO or somebody who's sort of, their forte is opening doors, finding businesses that look about right, you know, either adding to the market, or as Steve was pointing out, are earnings accretive. You're adding value to your own business simply because of your valuation, the way you're valued. And they don't necessarily look forward at the post-deal, real post-deal costs or real post-deal problems, which is about the integration, both of the people and of the technology. And I'd have said the people one is almost causes the more problems. And it's not something that generally gets looked at in terms of communication style. You know, I've worked with businesses where the president, this was in the States, the president had a corner office and could see the entire staff. And the subsequent acquisition was a company which had developers in 20 something, almost 30 states. And so their entire communication was online and electronic, and trying to merge those 2 businesses together afterwards was incredibly difficult, as one might imagine. And actually was put on hold for 3 years. The 2 products were there and the products were sold. And that's one of the other things that, you know, they were looking at. Actually, it was about selling the products. And as a result, the 2 businesses were kept very, very separate. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons in there why you're not going to get at the real depth of detail necessarily. But if you're putting the brief together, you've got to be very clear as to the sorts of things that you're looking at and the sorts of things post-deal that you've got to try and investigate, because those are the bits that are going to cause the problems.
Ross, I've just seen Ross. Thank you very much for that, by the way, Chris. That's really, really insightful. Ross Tomlinson.
Yeah, hi. So yeah, I was just going to say, I've done some stuff for a large sovereign wealth fund, buy side and sell side due diligence. And from my experience, it's also doing any analysis between what you're digging up and what's being provided by the company, and seeing what's, as much as anything, not being said in the reports. There was a large company that they were acquiring, and we noticed about $2 billion worth of additional cost to implement the strategy post acquisition, and that meant, well, we were able to reduce the purchase cost by well, a large majority of that discrepancy. So yeah, there's like the previous speaker was saying, you're not going to see a lot of the detail, especially on the larger acquisitions, but often it's asking those sort of almost quite easy to answer low-level questions around simple processes, and if they've not got those simple processes down, they're probably not going to be able to do the more complex things that you would expect them to be able to do. And the other thing is, even if it's a large organization, they're probably not nearly as good as you think they are at anything.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ross. Kaustav, I noticed you've got your mic unmuted. I don't know if that was from last time, if you had something else you wanted to add there.
No, well, I was like, whilst you were all talking, I did a bit of a Google and found a rather helpful smart sheet called mergers and acquisition templates for businesses. So, and a lot of what it says correlates with pretty much everything you guys have all been saying. That was quite helpful.
Amazing. Okay. So one thing that I'm interested in here, so again, it's kind of a few questions in one here. Like, what have you learned? Right, like for the people that have done more than one, what have you learned now that you didn't know before? So what kind of, either from mistakes that you've made or things that you've done well or anything like that? What are you better at now? And I guess in answering that, what makes good due diligence and what makes bad due diligence? So any way that you want to attack that question. Rich, can I trouble you for one on that?
Yeah, no, I was thinking about because there are several questions there, I guess. Good due diligence, I suspect that bad due diligence from the point of view of the consumers of the due diligence, so, you know, the M&A acquirer or the PE or VC fund. Bad due diligence is either going to be something very straightforward, like just, you know, inaccurate, lazy reporting, or the sort of the 60-page report that goes into immense detail but doesn't necessarily understand its audience greatly. One of the things that I consider to be pretty much essential to my business development as a provider is getting to know the people who I would like to work with and understanding where their heads are at, and, you know, and where the gaps are in their understanding. So, you know, there are a number of funds where, you know, they're doing deep tech stuff. They understand the implications of the work they're doing. They understand, you know, the fact that there are a lot of innovative businesses doing very interesting things, and that those businesses need investment to work. But there is really no reason why they should fully understand the implications of serverless computing, for example. You know, it's things like serverless computing and, you know, ways of deploying out machine learning models are, you know, their implementation challenges. I know there are some DD providers, because I've seen their reporting, who will go into immense detail on the quality and the robustness of the way that a particular company deploys software out to the cloud. And there are some VC funds who have analysts who will understand that and actually make recommendations on the basis of it. Most won't. So I think one of the things which I don't think I'd quite wrap my head around when I was sitting on the other side of the table originally, say 10 years ago as a CTO, is getting that pitch right for the audience and understanding what the consumers of your due diligence reporting data are going to need. So ultimately that comes down to wrapping your head around what their focus is, what they want to get out of the investment, and the fact that they will see tech DD as covering their bases commercially, fundamentally. You know, they're not there to be tech experts. They're probably not that enthused overall about, you know, about the hammer. They're interested in the house that the hammer is building. And so by all means, you can talk about how this company, you know, leading the way with modern practices, and their development team is, you know, is using a particular methodology, but it's on, you know, the onus is on the due diligence provider to explain what the impact is on the commercials. You know, the fact that by doing it this way, it means that a potential industry exit 6 months down the line or 2 years down the line will be aided because they're working in a methodical, you know, standards-based way with documentation that's going to make it easy to integrate with a different team, for example. So your job as the specialist is to provide context, and that ultimately is where your value lies. Because otherwise, you know, investment companies could just insist as part of the data room that the head of engineering writes up a really detailed set of architecture documents and just refuse to sign off on it. What they're looking for is someone who can bridge the gap between the engineering team and an understanding of what investors are looking for, reassurance wise.
Really well put. Will, did you have something you want to add there?
Yeah, I think just building on that, and it's a difficult question, and I didn't know whether to think about it from the point of view of like what's more fun to engage with as a process, or what's more useful for consumers of DD. But I think just thinking about the difference in DD reports that I've looked at or been involved in putting together. Something which mentioned earlier was like a traffic light system or a risk register. Concrete things like that are actually really useful, and I think bad DD often looks either like a report with no opinions in it at all, just useless levels of detail and fact, or sometimes it can look like an attempt to reduce it to a really binary decision. So either like, should we or shouldn't we invest in this proposition, which isn't, I don't think really is the place of someone performing technical DD, unless you find some, you know, terrible skeleton in the closet. I think being able to find that middle ground of actually, here are some of the salient points that are specific to the technical domain and the risks they represent. I think that is the best kind of DD, really.
I would add to that, yeah, absolutely. You know, to Will's point, everything that you're writing within that document is about observation, conclusion, recommendation. So it's what you've seen, effectively what you read into it, and then what you're recommending as part of, you know, either in terms of what's needed to be done, or whether it's a problem, whether it's a positive. So yeah, absolutely build from what Will was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm just trying to think of a good analogy. It's yeah, I mean, it's similar to an architect, actually. You know, both a technical architect and an architect of buildings. You know, you're providing services to a client. You know, you're not an arbiter of taste. You're a specialist consultant, and your job is to deliver up a you know, as unbiased and objective as you can be report, in order that the decision makers have something in a context they can understand to make an informed decision. So I can certainly say to them, hey, look, if it was my £5 million, this is how I'd feel about it. But, you know, and if they ask me to, I happily will do, and I'll say, hey, look, you know, I'm not a financier, I'm not in charge of your funds, but if this were my money, this is the view I'd be taking on it, if they ask me to. But actually, you know, they don't often ask me to, and it's much more useful for them, for me to be able to say, well, look, you know, this particular decision or this particular piece of technology or this particular team dynamic has this implication on the team. And so if this is what you're thinking, it will be important. If it's not, actually, you probably want to be thinking and keeping an eye on this thing over here instead. It's up to them what they want to do with that information. but ultimately the buck stops with them when it comes to fund management and how they choose to work with the investor, with the target company moving forward. I want to make sure that they go into that with their eyes open.
Super interesting. Do you know what? I've noticed we got Ben Ford on the call. I don't know if Ben's there or just as a spectator there, but it reminds me a lot about a military kind of planning for a military operation. When you say about getting all those details and making sure that they've got to be bang on, and a conversation that I was having with Ben some weeks ago. But yeah, really interesting stuff. Okay, how do you go forward on in terms of if you wanted to start picking up work? Where would you go with that if you wanted to pick up new due diligence work?
I'll go first. A few different places. Networking fairly heavily. COVID has made things a little bit tricky and certainly very different for networking. I find virtual speed networking events quite useful. If anyone's used Lunch Club, lunchclub.ai, that's also quite handy. There's probably a 50-50 hit and miss ratio on the matches that you get with Lunch Club. The idea is you sign up, you give it your interest professionally, and then it hooks you up with people who professionally match your interests. And the more you use it, the more choice you get over the types of people that you talk to. So if you have lots of successful Lunch Club meetings and you say, yes, that was a good match, then they're a lot more likely to automatically match you up with, say, investors. But in the absence of physical events and startup incubator days and that sort of things to go along to, it really is about walking your network and figuring out who you know, who knows useful people, seeing if you can talk through the network and try and get useful introductions. I personally hate it, but I have had to do more cold contact than I'm used to. I would much prefer a personal recommendation. But I have had a bit of success just name dropping existing clients to other clients. But by and large, actually, most of my business over the last 3 or 4 months has come from events like this, where I've just been talking to other CTOs and investors and building up some credibility and some brand through displays of the fact that they know what I'm doing, basically. I'm quite British. Shameless self-promotion isn't necessarily the most instinctive thing for me, but the pandemic has made it quite tricky to do that outside of forums and events like this. So I find them tremendously useful.
Yeah, I think there's so much room for it. Whilst the pandemic's has made some things tricky and much harder like that. Those impromptu meetings, I think you can run a clinic every day on this kind of thing and have people from all over the place tune in quite easily. And I've seen a few people doing this kind of thing, and yeah, so interesting to hear that you've had some success with it. Have you had anything on the cold side? Has that led to much for you, Rich?
Bits and pieces. I mean, I use the word cold loosely. It tends to be, I will have a conversation with someone and they may say, oh, I've heard that so-and-so at, this VC fund has got some interesting stuff in the pipeline. And then I will contact them directly, but say, oh, I heard from a conversation I was having with person X that you might be looking for someone who can help out with this. It doesn't tend to be completely cold. By and large, it's very unusual for someone just to get a completely cold, hello, you look interesting type conversation going, unless there's some sort of mutual credibility factor going on there. People working for VC funds get enough cold contact from professionals and also companies looking for investment that increasingly during pandemic times with people working from home, there are a lot of VC funds who just don't have a phone number anymore. They want to have as much as possible mediated via email and online contact forms for people joining incubation cohorts. And that doesn't necessarily leave much space for providers like us. So introductions are frankly just much easier if you can find a second or third level contact who can put you in touch with the right person. It's just a much more guaranteed way of at least getting a conversation in.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Okay, we're approaching 5:30 now. Does anyone else have any final burning questions that they wanted to ask Rich or anyone else on the call? Oh, yeah, Ranjit, yeah.
Yeah, I got a question. So this is just for everyone. Has anyone encountered an instance where, irrespective of all your technical recommendations you are given in due diligence, the company has actually stopped the acquisition process? Because in my experience, irrespective of everything, usually the acquisition process goes through because both sides want it to happen. And just as what Steve and Chris made the comment before, like, because it's already financials and everything has been agreed or already being due diligence, then the technical due diligence becomes an afterthought. And so it's almost like a ticking in the boxes. So has anyone experienced where you gave all the technical due diligence recommendations, but the company just stopped because of that?
Yeah. So I have to think about my words carefully because I can't talk about the details. There was a company. They were relying on some public APIs that turned out they were going to be going away, but this was like breaking news and it wasn't widely publicized, and the whole diligence process was based on the idea that these APIs from a different company were going to be remaining. And so after sort of figuring out what the company was doing with these APIs, how it was in fact core to their proposition, and that they were going to have difficulty continuing their service a few months after we were doing the diligence, it made it very difficult for the company to continue showing that they would have the value that the acquiring company thought they were going to have. So that's the most kind of closest thing to what you're saying that I've experienced. I've had situations also just where the product just wasn't as good as it seemed on paper. So there are a few cases of that. I would estimate that about a quarter of the deals that I've been involved in did not go through.
Thanks, Steve. I have also encountered where the product has been failing or the product roadmap has been not been good, and also about financials. But in my experience, technical, you gave a very good example. My experience, irrespective of it, it just goes through. And sometimes, you know, as a CTO or a technical person, it would be really disheartening to see that going through.
In my experience, it's adjusted the price paid because the reporting within the due diligence document, you're looking at effectively budget and timescales to fix any of the technical debt and any of the other areas that need investment. So that will be used as a negotiating tool to affect the price paid, or to yeah, really ultimately it's affecting the price paid rather than whether it goes through or not.
Yeah, I'm with Chris on that. I think I've only ever had one situation where a due diligence job that I did ended up with transaction not going through at all. And that was actually the other way around. It wasn't because the technology platform was bad. It was because actually their tech capability and their CTO was unexpectedly good, and their CEO paled in comparison. And actually they found discrepancy between the CEO, who was at that point perceived as holding the company back a little bit, versus their capability. That was seen to be the problem. And they prodded and poked a little bit more and found out that actually the CEO turned out to be a little bit of a control freak who didn't want to step aside and sort of go into a supporting founder/consultant role in favor of someone with more growth experience, which was not at all what was expected. They thought it would be the other way around entirely.
Brilliant. Well, guys, thank you so much for all tuning in. Really, really appreciate it. Keep the feedback coming to us, please. You should have a feedback form, so let us know if there's anything in particular you want to hear from in the future, or hear the next event on, or you want to go into any more detail on due diligence, or be connected with anyone that's on here. Then let me know. I'll probably pop out just a doc with that everyone can sign up to. So. Or I might just do it on LinkedIn. I tell you what, I'll put a post out on LinkedIn. So if you're not following me on LinkedIn, then just follow me there and you'll see it there. And then obviously anyone that comments or likes can engage and follow each other. So yeah, thank you very much. Thanks again to everyone for getting involved, and I'll see you next time.